Well, good evening, and thanks for joining us here on our YouTube channel. We're just trying to put as much content out for you, especially as many of you are in your home, and I am too. And as I've got it started, a cat decided to loudly eat cat food over there. My son's upstairs. He may interrupt, but we've talked about this, not to do that. But like you, I'm here in my house in the middle of the week doing my job. My life's been interrupted radically, not only being here and doing meetings to granular technology. I apologize. This screen looks really granular to me. I'm imagining Kenny and Nathan may not like the quality of the video, but I'm doing the best I can. But I'm also teaching school, and like many of you, just everything's been different. And I think it's an opportunity when our rhythms have been disrupted or suffering comes into our life, or both, is to have an understanding and a rooting of what suffering can mean and what a purpose perhaps behind it and what we can learn from it. So I'm going to share with you in this class essentially slides. So be a lot of looking at a PowerPoint, and it's all based on the book that we're studying together, which is Tim Keller's Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. We're not going to do every chapter, and just going to do what I think feels right. But the main thing I want to say is if you're in the middle of suffering right now, this week might feel dismissive of that, and not because the content isn't good. It's just it starts in the theoretical. We want to look at all the different worldviews of suffering, all the other religions and what they say, and compare that to Christianity. But what you might want to do is go ahead and advance to an interview we're going to do, and we're going to do this every week. We'll interview somebody who has gone through something in their life that suffering pulled out of them, and we can glean a lot of wisdom. And if you're in the middle of suffering, I think what you might find is the most relatable part of it is the stories. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our guest today, which is Sally Ward, who will share details of what happened to her and her family 2 years ago. So why don't we start? And I want to start with a story, not to confuse you, but from another book called Remember Death by Matthew McCullough. And the foreword is by a guy named Russell Moore. Some of you maybe heard of him. And in the foreword, he tells this story about his grandfather's gravesite that he stumbled upon when I think he was lost one day. And he was driving, and it's one of these cemeteries that ended up being behind the church. And we've got our guest here with us now, so she can eavesdrop into this part. But essentially, he tells a tale as when he came into this region, he called his grandmother and asked her, am I at the right place? And of course, she confirmed that for him. And so listen to just what he says about seeing this gravesite and the things that put in perspective. He thought, as I kept praying and walking around the graves, I wondered about the people there. And in the ground beneath me, how many of them had heard my grandfather preach the gospel? How many found Jesus in the church behind me? How many had prayed with my grandfather to receive Christ, or at the funeral of a loved one, or maybe even like I was then, as they were facing a major life decision? And they were gone now. But then I thought about who in the ground beneath me might have been, possibly even a thorn in the flesh to my grandfather. How many had criticized his preaching or questioned whether he did hospital visits often enough? And maybe someone, had even, as is sadly altogether practiced in some churches, started an anonymous letter campaign to oppose the building of that sanctuary. They were gone too. And in that moment, I came to realize that maybe, as Tolkien put it, not all who wander are lost. Perhaps I was there for just this reason, to contemplate that whatever it was that had filled my grandfather with joy during his time here, and whatever kept him worrying at night, much of it was buried beneath me. And that's the finality of what death does, but also suffering puts a lot of things in perspective for us. So let's start now with just going over just briefly of our slides, and bear with me as I navigate doing these kinds of things. I've really learned a lot of new technology in the last 2 weeks. So this is our study, Timothy Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And I love his preaching. I love his writing. In fact, my son this morning, as he heard me jogging on the street, he's like, "Do you always listen to Tim Keller?" And I was like, "Well, actually, I'm not today, but I just really think he's brilliant, and I really appreciate his work." So let's start with hearing from him directly. And this is something, if you were here on Sunday online, you heard me sort of allude to similar what he's saying here, that no matter what precautions we take, no matter how well we have put together a good life, no matter how hard we have worked to be healthy, wealthy, comfortable with friends and family, and successful with our career, something will inevitably ruin it. So let's start looking at, I think it's a total of 5 different cultures and their views on it. And so the first one that we'll look at is sort of cultures that are like the karma-driven phase. And I can put on here neurotic Christianity as well, because I definitely think there's some, and maybe I can move my guy over here because he's blocking my slide. Okay. All right. So how does a karma-driven culture view suffering? Now, one thing I want to say up front is that all of these cultures, except for the Western secular culture, they all have a view of accepting suffering. So you'll see they're all very distinct, but they share one thing in common, that they admit that suffering is part of life, and they don't try to avoid it quite like Western culture does. So let's start with the first one. Their view that why does suffering even happen? It happens because of something that you did. You've done something to deserve it, and you need to pay it back, as you have obviously brought it on yourself. So it's up to you to right the suffering that's come to you. So it puts all the focus on you when you're going through it. It makes it something on the lines of a moral decision you've made, and you need to wake up and change your ways. Otherwise, the suffering won't go away. One way you can avoid suffering in this model is just to live well. And the reason I put neurotic Christianity is I think a lot of times, I mean, I certainly have times where, these lies kind of creep in. They're like, well, this is happening because I did something. And like we have this really capricious God who's just looking for, to teach us a lesson. And that is not what Christianity teaches. This is actually what other faiths teach. That is not what Christianity teaches on suffering. So let's move to the next one. And this is the SelfTranscendent. So this is the Buddhist view, the Greek Stoics, and even communal societies. And I'll explain that in just a bit. In fact, let me start there. Communal societies, that's like that is where the view of the self is lost in such a way because you're for the greater good of the tribe or the community that you're part of or the family, that the individual self is just sort of bleeds into one, like the community. Well, Buddhism is similar to that, where it sort of says that, the essence of Buddhism is essentially that you're not an individual self. You are, you're kind of like a little, drop of water in an ocean, and you belong to that ocean. So to think of yourself as distinct or individual is not the reality of who you are. So now in these views, particularly Buddhism, maybe exclusively that, suffering comes from this challenge of desire that we have in life, where we want things and we don't get them. And so we feel some sort of form of suffering when we don't have these things. And so desires come from this lie that we think that life is real, and that what we need to do is view our life as an illusion, and particularly stop believing that we are an individual self. So the key in all this is to detach from desire, and from seeing yourself, and from material things, and from people. So they accept suffering as a reality. But because suffering is so painful, the way to sort of mitigate that pain is to detach from things and to get yourself out. The next view would be more like Islam and sort of ancient pagan cultures, where we call it more of a fatalistic culture, where things are set by this just inscrutable will of a God who's capricious, and he is going to just give it to you. And what we want to do in the face of suffering, if you know what this faith believes, is that the honorable person is a person who, no matter, even though they can't change their suffering, they have a destiny, and what they need to do is live honorably in the face of suffering, and to surrender to God and to yield to God in the face of all of your suffering. So again, all of this sort of drives you inward. Like the moralistic culture, you've got to fix this. This is sort of similar. It's on you to make it right, to live honorably. That's where all your virtue comes from. So it puts a lot of emphasis on yourself in that. Now, a dualistic culture, this one's a little bit, I'm least familiar with this one the most, but essentially, it's sort of this epic battle between good and evil. So really, that there's this, maybe it's more of a view of like the universe. The universe is at work, like maybe even more like Star Wars, like balance in the force, and just things are always like yin and yang, moving back and forth and never ending. But then one day there will be an end to all things, and good will eventually triumph over evil. Like the forces of darkness will lose to the forces of light. But when suffering comes, what that is essentially, it's a result of you just being a victim caught up in this epic battle that's going on in that. And so essentially, there's some ancient faiths that believe that, very, I think from like maybe Northern Europe. So what, again, they all share in common is that suffering's unavoidable. It happens. We can't change anything about it. We respond with internal work. We can change some things, if particularly the moralistic culture, the first one we looked at, if we do good now. And good will come one day. There'll be bliss. We'll escape into bliss. And I think to a degree, Christianity, some Christians believe, like, hey, that's it. We just have this terrible life now. But thank God we get to float play harps with angels on clouds, as if that's a reward. But essentially, we kind of sometimes Christians join in that with sort of an escapist view of things. Here's another quote from Keller. If we are not deliberately thinking about our culture and our context, we will be conformed to it without ever knowing. And you can kind of see that in all of these views, sometimes they just bleed into ours, and we don't see it. I mean, Stoicism particularly, boy, that is like bled into Christianity through and through for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, this is a culture most likely you're part of. I mean, this is for Grace Blue Ridge, but it is out there, so I don't know who else is watching this. But Western culture, we value the material world more than anything else. That we don't. This is like the deconstructed era of Western culture. We're really where we're at now, where we've just deconstructed everything, and nothing is made of the spirit. It's just made of matter. And so what happens is that with this view, and I think this will show up here a little later in another slide, is that to find purpose and meaning in life, we have to have it from the material world. And to find happiness, it has to come from the material world. So of course, suffering is always a barrier to that. And we view it as having no purpose. It is senseless. It's without any reason, and it's just random. It's just an accident that happens. If it happens, then it's just bad luck, really, more than anything else. And but certainly looking to a God in that is like juvenile. So the attitude of Western culture when suffering comes, that it's sort of, it is what it is. And so because our values that ultimately you can see here, let's see if I can use this little laser pointer. Here we go. We decide the kind of life we want to seek most, that we see as most valuable, and we want to create that. It's up to us. So again, very similar, it drives us inward like the other views, but they're very distinct. Western culture has a very low view of suffering, very other than just saying it's just an unfortunate thing that happens and it's a hiccup and it's just in the way of our pursuits of what we want. And what this means is, and then we have to grab with all the gusto of all the things that are in front of us in this world. So, you only live once, or bucket list. It's our culture that's created that. Why? Because we think this is all there is. And that inherently can make us very selfish, because ultimately we want to avoid suffering in this model. We don't want stuff to get on us from other people that might bring suffering on us. And unfortunately, I didn't write the name of the person who created this great quote, but this person said, "It is because the meaning in life in the United States is the pursuit of personal freedom that suffering becomes so traumatic for us, for Americans." And so let's distinguish, as we review a little bit of this, that we, as Westerners, we don't see meaning and purpose. Again, this is totally deconstructed with no faith background. We just do not see suffering as part of a coherent story. It's just something that happens to us. And we don't see it that it's crucial for growth. We don't see it that way. We don't see it as character forming. And so, this is why we rebel against it. It has no use. And we must manage, minimize, avoid, distract it. So here's a great example. In like 2 weeks, not even that, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. Today is March 31st, 2020. So 2 weeks ago, in the midst of all that's going on, and things have been so fluid with COVID-19, but there were still spring breakers down in Miami Beach. With all of the social distancing that's been told for us to do, they didn't do that. And the thought is, well, I'm young and that's what it is. I'm not susceptible to this. Well, we've even learned 2 weeks later that it's really creeping into younger populations. But, people have sort of, obviously a lot of people have been upset about this, and rightly so. But one of them was interviewed, and listen to what this person said on the beach. They were asked by somebody, "Why are you here given all the things that have been, recommended for your society? You're putting others at risk. You're putting yourself at risk. Why are you here?" And this person said, "At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying. We're just living for the moment." And we look at that as like, oh, that's immature, blah, blah, blah. They're just kids being kids. Again, and I said this 2 days ago on Sunday, that it's just us this person's taking their cues from culture that's said, like, the material world is everything. Why would you need to live for yourself? We're just living for the moment. That's Western culture. That's what that is. So the problem with Western culture, and this is why I'm hitting this one more, because obviously this is where we're at, we're the most under-resourced culture of all cultures that have ever lived, probably in the history of humanity, for suffering. At least the other four views that we've looked at least they accept suffering, but we don't. And so we don't have ways to endure suffering with patience. Again, it's our highest goal to prevent it. It's and by the way, just real quick, it's not like we should be looking for suffering. Clearly, social justice, it's all over the Old Testament. Those of you who were with us in the Isaiah series, you see it. A lot of times we struggle with the wrath of God, and yet you see so often it's because of how unjust his people were acting towards one another in their society. And so it's not that we are just supposed to just fall on the sword for suffering. And there are ways we must remove suffering from others. This is what justice movement is all about, and why we need that. And yet at the same time, though, what happens is that ultimately what we want to do is completely rebel against it, and we don't have the resources when suffering does come to us. So her name is Larissa. I don't know how to pronounce that last name, but we'll just say Larissa M. Okay, with the Boston Review. Listen to what she said. She's critiquing. She's not a believer. She's critiquing her own culture. She's saying for secular people, it's all up to us. We are alone here. That's why for secular people, there can be an additional layer of urgency and despair, referencing what happens when suffering comes. So let's just review everything real quick. Christianity, and this is where we're going to really hit over the weeks to come, but this is just a brief primer for all that. And the distinction between Christianity and the fatalistic view, its view on suffering, is that we're invited to express emotions and grieve more honestly, in our grief more honestly. So we looked at Gethsemane 2 days ago. This Sunday, we're going to look at Jesus on the cross, and he's here he is in sheer agony, and yet he's praying for others. He's praying for their suffering to not happen. He's praying forgiveness for them. He's on the cross taking care of his mother and John from the cross, and yet from the cross, what is he also doing? He's lamenting. My God, why have you forsaken me? In the Garden of Gethsemane, he is in sheer agony. And so there's no value in Christianity in sort of having a stoic approach, this utilitarian approach to suffering that we are invited to feel. And in fact, that's what we must do, and to weep. And Jesus went around weeping and feeling emotion and expressing emotion in the face of suffering. Contra the self-transcendental view, again, we're invited to feel pain. So, again, I sometimes sense from some Christians where Christianity is this thing, if we really believe the gospel, we'll never really feel anything anymore because we're just so united to Christ. I just don't believe that that's biblical or healthy. And you got a problem, Chinsis? You want out? He does want out. Hang tight with it. All right. Yeah. Welcome to the real world, folks. There you go. All right. Contra the moralistic view, suffering does not discriminate. That's the view that, look, if we live a perfect righteous life, that we can avoid suffering. That's just not realistic. Jesus lived a perfect life. That's not what Christianity teaches. He lived a perfect life and suffered. And contra the dualistic view, it doesn't promote pride. We don't get trophies for, suffering in the Christian view is not one of these things where we sort of distance ourselves with others and say, well, you've never been through that. So don't, I can look down on you now. And that happens. And that's the hard thing. I mean, I think we all do that. We kind of develop sometimes a bit of a victim mentality where we just think nobody can relate to us. And it's just an opportunity to create an unhealthy wall. And contra the Western view, we believe that suffering is meaningful. So here's Keller again from page 30 in chapter 1. Christianity teaches that contra fatalism, suffering is overwhelming. Contra Buddhism, suffering is real. And contra karma, suffering is often unfair. But contra secularism, suffering is meaningful. There's a purpose to it, and if faced rightly, it can drive us like a nail deep into the love of God and to more stability and spiritual power than you can imagine. I'll leave us with this last quote, and this will be something we look at next week. But, some suffering in the Christian worldview is given in order to chastise and correct a person for wrongful patterns, as in the case of Jonah. Some suffering is given not to correct a past wrongs, but prevent future ones. That's Genesis 37 through 50, the Joseph story. And in some cases, suffering has no purpose other than to lead a person to love God more ardently for himself alone and discover the ultimate peace and freedom. So I'm going to stop the share and we're going to dial in Sally. And I think we're at a good spot to do that. So how about I unmute you now here and figure out how to do that. Okay, apologize here. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Sorry if I sound like a TV host. This is awesome.
Just awkward.
Yeah, it is. But how about some brief backstory on how we know each other? So Sally was the first person we've ever met in Hendersonville, technically speaking, because in 2007, December of 2007, Catherine and I came here to interview with leaders from Grace Community Church as they were looking to church plant. And so we interviewed for this position and we stayed with Sally and Bobby and quickly became good friends. And Sally feels like, a spiritual sister in the faith, and just a dear friend to all of us. And I was going to say also like another mother, but I didn't want to be.
You don't want to make me that old? That's okay.
No. But, so anyway, we're really grateful for you. But it was a scary time, May of 2018, or was that even in April?
April of 2018. Yeah.
Why don't you walk us through what happened first?
Okay. Can you hear me? Because I can hear you. I'm just making sure.
I can totally hear you. Shut
great.
up my earbuds right now. So.
Okay, no problem. So Bobby and I were at a work event, and I all of a sudden got this severe headache within just really like a few seconds. It came on very suddenly. And I told Bobby, I said, I think we need to leave. And he said, I'm taking you to the ER. He was worried. And I was starting to feel some numbness and tingling. So I was a little worried too. And I'll cut out a lot of parts. But the basic thing was that they found some bleeding on my brain. And when Bobby told me that, and he said, they're going to have to transport you to Mission. And so the last really coherent memory I have of those kind of 48 hours there was riding in the ambulance and kind of wondering, okay, am I going to live or am I going to die? Because I knew enough to know that, bleeding on the brain could mean only a few things. And so I lost consciousness at some point up there, and I have a couple of holes in my head where they drilled in to put in a tube to drain the fluids, and then they did a procedure. I was diagnosed with a ruptured cerebral aneurysm, and they were able to do a procedure to, for lack of a better word, repair the aneurysm. And I was in the neural ICU at Mission for 3 weeks, and then after that, when I was sent home, even though I didn't thankfully have any strokes or anything, I was left with kind of a lot of just weakness and still pain and this ongoing thing I used to call shaky brain. So it was a lot of just months of recovering from that. And I still have some residual side effects, not nearly as severe as a lot of people, but that's the basic incident, if you will, that introduced that kind of physical suffering in our lives.
Yeah. I don't know if you were eavesdropping in a second ago when I was going through some of the slides, or if you've read Keller's book, but one of the distinctions that the Christian worldview makes on suffering versus our culture that we live in is that it can actually be purposeful. I'm curious how that time and your suffering since then has, how have you experienced it as being purposeful?
Well, one of the things I used to say before this, and I still say it, is a lot of times when you're suffering, ask yourself, what have I prayed for in the past? You know, what have I asked God to do in my life? Times when I've really just prayed this really heartfelt prayer. And if you had known how God was going to answer it, you might have dialed it back and not prayed that prayer. And one of the things that I had been aware of more and more in my adult life, but probably only in more recent years, was how a struggle with vulnerability kept me from kind of being integrated emotionally, intellectually, and physically. So that vulnerability with God, that vulnerability with my husband and with other people, I just had kind of absorbed based on childhood stories, but also just my own personality, that the way you get through suffering is you hunker down and you just push through it. Kind of that stoicism approach. Yeah. And that,
and you grew up in the Bible Belt too, didn't you?
Oh yeah. And I grew up in a believing home, and my mom suffered a lot, and that's essentially how she did it. So that's, that's what I thought. That seemed like the right thing to do. So, so I had started already doing a little bit of work on that, asking God to, help me to be more please help me be more vulnerable a little bit, and it's like, I was thinking, okay, he's going to educate me, or he's going to teach me a little bit, and maybe I'll get a paid internship. But instead, he made it my full-time job to be vulnerable. And so, that's kind of how I see the part of the purpose of that.
Well, and that brings up a question, and I shot to you, I think yesterday or Sunday, but what this has done in terms of the pursuit of emotional health for you. And I think you just alluded to that, but would you be willing to expand a little more, like what would not have happened if this event had not happened, in terms of your healthy pursuit of vulnerability, intimacy with Christ, intimacy with others, and taking time to explore even trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can never know what you would have done differently, right? But it certainly, I don't know if the word is fast-tracked, but it definitely directed me into exploring some of those areas more intimately. Last year, Bobby and I were part of the Re-Engage class, and already what had happened as a result of this is I felt like I was over here, and Bobby and the rest of my family were over here. And I didn't know how to get us together. And that some of that was based on my ideas about vulnerability. And so going through that class helped us to put words and know how to communicate and build that intimacy. We had to, in order for us not to be in separate places, we had to build intimacy, because we went through two different experiences of the trauma of that whole event. And then I had sort of I think it was a PTSD event when I had some testing this past fall, where I had a routine test. It wasn't even a difficult test, and everything was fine, but it brought back with kind of an intensity, a lot of brain fatigue and other stuff like that. And I started I remember hearing people talk about EMDR, and I was like, maybe I need to look into that. And so I did explore that, and that's a whole nother story. Anybody can ask me about it if they want to. But what I found was that, any trauma, which, that was a trauma that I went through, is layered upon lots of traumas in my past as well. And that as I have done some of the therapy with that, it's healed not only some of the things from my hospital stay, that trauma, but even some trauma that was in my past. And I've seen the Lord's hand in it, which is what's really cool. And it's made me more able to see his presence in all things, if you will, kind of like looking at it from up here instead of just right at the presence of whatever the suffering was.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how we benefit from others suffering. And I think that I know that I've heard you invite others, including myself, to, I mean, you've kind of called me out on, hey, I can be vulnerable from the pulpit, but, with people in the not regular life, as if Sunday's not real, but just that call, that pursuit to offer all of yourself to God, not just parts of ourselves. And that's certainly, hopefully one day we can have a class on talking about those things, particularly about the book Boundaries for Your Soul, which you recommended to us, which was super helpful. Another question, Joe, is just, I mean, one, you scared the heck out of me when you said, we're scared to pray bold prayers. Like, I don't want to hear that. And I have prayed these sort of prayers like at all costs. And then all of a sudden I think, well, what if that means this, that, and the other? And that obviously, as we're going through these slides, I'm like, well, that sounds like karma, And yet, how do we pray in such a way that might be willing to be open to even the suffering of, losing our attachments to unhealthy things, our distractions?
Yeah, I know that. I think years ago, Bobby and I had this family mission statement. We were in a class and they had us do this, and we spent some time going through. And one of those things, and it's on the wall in our house, is allow suffering to make us the people that God wants us to be. And I remember when we were looking at that, we didn't want to say, give us suffering. I don't think that's what Christian says, but, suffering is inevitable. And so we were like, allow it to do that. And so, I didn't know what that was going to look like. And, that was written over 20 years ago that we wrote that down. And I wouldn't say that every day. I've prayed since then, oh Lord, send some suffering to make me who you want me to be. That's just not what I prayed. But and for each of these things in our family mission statement, we have scriptures, that are there that are part of it. And so one of the scriptures for that was about the discipline one, which some people go, well, is suffering discipline? Well, it doesn't seem clear. It just seems that trials and suffering are discipline, not in the sense that God's like out to get us, but he shapes us through them. And so, but it's never pleasant at the time. It's painful. But I love the last part of that verse in Hebrews 12, where it says, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. And so who doesn't want righteousness? Who doesn't want peace? Right? And, but God knows what it takes to produce that in us. And am I willing to kind of submit to it in that, or see it through that lens, maybe is a better way, although it is a submission as well. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, you totally did. And I think, like I referenced recently the podcast that of Johnny Erickson. I think she was also with Nancy Guthrie, who I think she's lost multiple children, and I just was suffering. It just polishes so much, it smooths out so many rough edges in us, and you can just hear the character in them that can only be shaped by suffering. I mean, I think that's why we have terms like fire. Suffering is likened to a metaphor biblically, fire. When you walk through the fire, I will be with you. But, fire doesn't just burn up things. It also refines things. It makes gold more pure, and eliminates impurities. And yet, I mean, I can look at, just, personal things, but also, too, just being in this role, like it will either harden you, being a pastor, make you very cynical, or it will soften you. And I kind of vacillate between the two, but I think the Lord's clearly had us on a direction of softening. And, but that brings up maybe one last question. And that is really, I think a lot of people who've been through tremendous suffering, they would not say, I wish that would, if they could, they would not wish it to happen again. That's masochism. That's not our desire. And I think it's important for us to always be reminded, where we were created is in a garden, it's paradise. And then actually, I know you're in the class yesterday, the passage is Jesus saying to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. And so, I mean, that's a place where there's no tears, no suffering. And so, again, the Christian view is not that we champion suffering or that we say we were made just for suffering. We were meant for nothing but pure, unadulterated happiness in the face of being in community with God face to face. But that being said, nobody, I don't think anybody who's ever suffered says, well, I wish I could do that again. But I definitely think everybody would say, and I'm sorry, my question is like a good 2 minutes long here, but essentially what I'm trying to ask is, though you wouldn't want to have that happen again, how would you be different today? As tomorrow is April 1st, so we're coming up on a 2-year. How are you different now from having that had happen?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, one is, when my head was hurting so bad, they call it the worst headache of your life. And when I was lying there and I was kind of coming in and out of consciousness, I couldn't use my mind, which is a big part of who I am, is using my mind, right? And I was like, but I knew, I just wanted to pray. And I just remember, I mean, kind of the concept, I know Jesus is with me, but I thought, I can say Jesus. So in my mind, I would just go, you want me to what?
Keep going, my battery's about to die. Just keep going, I'm listening.
Okay. In my mind, I would just say, Jesus. It's just like, it's all I could get out. And I knew that was enough. And so it was kind of like I had the opportunity to see what was true, which was that when everything is stripped away, that's there. Does that make sense? Absolutely. So I didn't have the near death experience where I saw the light and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's why I never thought, I didn't even feel like for sure, oh, I'm dying, because I thought, well, I didn't do that thing where I went up and saw my body and everybody working on it. But I needed to know that he was there. And I felt that. And there was another really neat experience too, where one day one of my daughters was reading a text from a friend. A friend was just telling me that she was praying for me about from Mark 6, where where Jesus is going to heal Jairus' daughter, but he gets stopped by the woman who touches his robe. And the friend who texted me, had no way of knowing that was a very significant passage to me. It's something that Jesus had given me years earlier in response to kind of a lot of things about just a lot of hurts and things like that, just him noticing me. And then my another daughter who was in the room heard me, all I said to the one daughter who read it was, I said, oh, wow, that's a really important passage to me. And then my other daughter who was in the room, that had been her exact passage that she had read in when she opened up her app that morning for devotions. And it was just it was like a further cementing of this idea that the word is powerful and that God sees me as an individual. And so going back to that, all the way back to what we were talking about, like something that we've prayed long ago, that's been one of my prayers. God, I want to know that you love me individually. And I felt like he answered that in that way. So there's a way in which I'm more certain of that. Going back to the thing that you asked earlier, I mean, the emotional piece, definitely, I think that's a big thing that happened out of this, and I'm really grateful for that. And then I was just really grateful to see how well the body of Christ love my family and me during that time. You know, I always wanted to be the one who gives, and to be on the receiving end of that is really humbling, but it's also, it changes you.
Hmm. And I think that brings up a good final question that I'll probably ask all of our guests. One of the challenges on the other end, of those who are suffering, is this feeling of saying the wrong thing, and because I've seen countless people in our church that have had well-meaning people really hurt them. And that's the hard thing. And so, I think a lot of people who are not in the particular situation where they're trying to move towards a person who's suffering feel this fear of saying the wrong thing. And then sometimes they don't say anything at all. What wisdom would you offer those who are either in suffering or approaching someone who's suffering about that particular situation? Like, I mean, what would you say to, let's start with the first part. What would you say you would say to someone who is suffering, what your patience and compassion needs to be for those who are trying to help you, who just don't do a good job at it? And then I think the second part is, if you're on the other end, like, what do you do with your fears of really messing this thing up?
I think we are called, if we're the one suffering and somebody's really missing us, I think if you feel like they're essentially a safe person, then I think you can say, hey, here's what I really need right now, and just be honest with them and see that. Sometimes you just need not to say anything, but know that God's at work in them too. And you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. They're not responsible for making me feel better. And sometimes we put that pressure on other, when you're suffering, I think sometimes we put pressure on others to make it okay. And, I think we can give them grace. Ask God. We're going to need grace to give them grace. I had something happen this past week with somebody, and we just missed each other, and that was hard. And we did eventually kind of talk through it. But the other question that you're asking, like, if you don't know what to do or say, I think it's just, that one's a little harder. I mean, because there's physical suffering, right? And then there's emotional suffering. And, physical suffering, if it's ongoing for somebody for a long time, you can ask them, what do you need? Well, if it's emotional suffering, I think you can say to them, I don't know how to help you. I'll pray with you. And I think just praying with people in the moment too is a big thing, which we're scared to do. We're scared we'll say something wrong. But I think it's a risk that we can take. Do we trust God to be there? What is going on in your house, Chaz?
Ask for quiet under the time, and just been coasting now. So I can creeping along, trying not to make noise. But oh my goodness, maybe we'll end the show with Chef coming on live.
Yeah.
What are you doing over there, man? What? Oh my goodness, just hold off on that, okay? Here, let's close. Cut. There's.
Hello, my friend.
How you doing, bud?
That kind of thing, bud. Okay. Miss Sally, though. You want to close our time out in prayer for us? Okay. All right. Let's not chew that. Let's just hold off just for a second. Okay. Hold off. I'm not kidding. All right. I'm going to close this in prayer. All right.
Thanks, Chad.
Lord, I know so many people are. Suffering is just, it's smelling salts. It's so disorienting. It demands all our faculties. And it has great potency and potential to draw us closer to your intimacy. I have known so many people who've suffered that's what they walk away with, is deeper intimacy. But it is frightening to think of what maybe needs to happen sometimes to get to that. But Lord, we are also thankful that the promise is that you are with us. And the promise is that Jesus, throughout the Gospels, you constantly were reversing suffering. And while we may suffer now, the promise also is you don't just evaporate it all. You don't just make us forget about it or dismiss it. And in some glorious way that we bring our tears with us into your kingdom, and they are white forever. And not only that, they are also renewed, that everything's restored. You are making all things new, not all new things. And we're just thankful that there's a river of life, that there's healing that is ongoing for all eternity, that a mystery to behold. And that, Lord Jesus, that in a way that we can understand, our pain will enhance the joy in this life and definitely, certainly in the next. So I thank you for Sally and Bobby and this wonderful family. And I thank you for our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I hope you guys all enjoyed our time together. And we're going to finish up the day doing other things here. Okay.
No, the reason why I hurt.
All right. No, hang on. Okay. This is real life. All right. You're interrupting, Han, so stop it. All right. Hopefully everybody thinks I'm a good parent still, right? All right. I will see you guys later. Bye.